In September of 2019, it was announced via Metallica's Instagram page that 18 years after getting sober, James Hetfield had gone back to rehab. The statement, which was issued by the other three members of the band, drummer Lars Ulrich, lead guitarist Kirk Hammett, and bassist Robert Trujillo, stated, "As most of you probably know, our brother James has been struggling with addiction on and off for many years. He has now, unfortunately, had to re-enter a treatment program to work on his recovery again." The news came as quite a shock to me and other fans of the band. While I will admit to not following the band quite as closely as I had in previous years, there was a finality to Hetfield's sobriety that to me, and perhaps many others, seemed unshakable. After decades of hard partying and inner turmoil, Metallica had been a consistent juggernaut in the music business that had been rolling on seamlessly without a hitch for 2 decades, with James Hetfield, serene, calm, wise, and most importantly of all, clean, at the helm. The man who against all odds had conquered the music business with the biggest metal band in history had finally conquered his demons for good. But things in life are rarely that simple. In the pantheon of heavy metal musicians, there are but a select few that can truly be classed as legendary. Ozzy Osbourne, Ronnie James Dio, Steve Harris, Tony Iommi, and Randy Rhoads are among those who belong on that shortlist. Right beside those on the upper echelon sits James Hetfield, the singer, rhythm guitar player, and principal songwriter for the biggest and most successful band in the history of metal, Metallica. Aside from being an icon, James Hetfield is also one of the most thoroughly covered metal musicians in history, featuring in film, television, books, and every other medium imaginable. So with that in mind, the focus of the video will be Hetfield's documented struggle with alcohol, his stints in and out of sobriety, and the events in his life that fueled his drinking, while also shaping the person he is today. I'm going to cover Hetfield autobiographically to an extent, just for the uninitiated, but by and large this video is going to focus on his alcoholism, as well as his personal traumas and his character. James Hetfield was born in Downey, California on August 3rd, 1963, to an opera singer mother and a truck driving father. He had a younger sister and 2 older half-brothers. For much of his life, Hetfield was brought up in a Christian Science household, a strict faith which forbids the use of modern medicine, trusting the healing of all ailments, diseases and injuries to God. One of the consequences of this was that Hetfield was unable to attend health class at school or participates in sports such as football, all of which made the already shy young man feel more alienated. When Hetfield was 13, his parents divorced, which resulted in Hetfield being estranged from his father for the rest of his youth and much of his adult life. Tragedy struck Hetfield yet again when his mother died at 16. Battling cancer, her devotion to her Christian Science faith forbade her from seeking medical help for the disease. Speaking with Classic Rock magazine, Hetfield described the ordeal. "We watched my mother wither away. My sister and I would look at each other and we couldn't really say anything. It was that whole catch-22 about acknowledging the illness. Then of course you were going to be sick. My brothers finally, they were old enough to understand this, said, 'Something's really wrong. Let's get her some help.' But it was much too late. Cancer, she died of it. There were no funerals, no grieving period where you're able to cry and get support. It was just, okay, the shell is dead, the spirit's gone, and move on in life." After his mother passed, Hetfield went to go live with his brother David and his wife, while his sister chose to stay with their biological father, a man whom Hetfield was not yet ready to forgive, much less reconnect with. Having to relocate to another place and another school, Hetfield became more withdrawn, unwilling to express or acknowledge his trauma. It's around this time that Hetfield sought solace in music. Originally learning to play the piano at the haste of his mother, James gravitated towards brother David's guitar and would spend hours alone in his room practicing and composing on his new instrument. It's also around this time that James started drinking. It was also around this time that Hetfield put an ad in the Recycler newspaper looking for fellow musicians with a similar taste for heavier music. The only other ad in the newspaper which matched his own read, quote, "Drummer looking for other metal musicians to jam with. Influences: Tigers of Pangtang, Diamond Head, Iron Maiden, Ask for Lars. The Lars in question was Lars Ulrich, a 17-year-old drummer originally born in Denmark. A young tennis prodigy from a wealthy family, Lars moved with his parents to the affluent LA suburb of Newport Beach. He attended a tennis academy, but upon finding the competition much stiffer in the US than his native Denmark, decided to shift his focus to music instead. Both men were total opposites. Lars came from a well-to-do, stable nuclear family who were extremely liberal and had an open-door policy for strangers. Hetfield came from a strict, hyper-religious working-class family which fell apart in front of his young eyes. Lars was loud, brash, yet approachable and undeniably charismatic, while James was shy and aloof with an intimidating demeanour. "We got two different kinds of personality," Hetfield would recount. "He wants to be the centre of attention all the time, and that bothers me because I'm the same way. He's out there charming people, and I'll be intimidating so people will respect me that way." However, the two young men shared two very critical interests in common: heavy metal and drinking. And both kids' worldviews and experiences were reflected in their drunken personalities. So while Lars would get louder and friendlier the more he drank, Hetfield would often get aggressive and take out his frustrations on his own drummer. That's how resentments would get released, Hetfield said, pushing and shoving, throwing things at him. After a revolving door of lead guitarists and bassists, the latter of which will become a reoccurring theme throughout the band's history, the nucleus of Metallica was formed when lead guitarist Dave Mustaine and bassist Cliff Burton rounded out the lineup. Now, the history of the group is far more complex than this, and again, I'm not going to delve into it too thoroughly. If you're watching this video, there is a high probability that you already know the band's story, or at least the Cliff Notes version. If not, I recommend pausing this video and reading through an online bio of the band, or perhaps even the Wikipedia page. If you're really interested in taking a deep dive into Metallica lore, there are a ton of biographies out there. Personally, I would recommend Bird School Metallica Death Volumes 1 and 2 by Ian Winwood and Paul Brannigan, or Enter Night by Mick Wall. Or you could just watch the Behind the Music documentary, I guess. The group drove out to New York City to record their first album with Megaforce Records. Founded and ran by Johnny and Martha Zazula, Johnny recalls his first encounter with the band. "We didn't know what to do because they were young and they were wild. The first second we were together, they raided the alcohol cabinet in my house of everything there was. They drank all the bottles down without even using glasses. They were all raging drunk and Dave Mustaine is throwing up all over the place. I was like, this is going to be interesting. They stayed with me and my wife Marsha for a little while, but that didn't work out, so we got them another place to stay." Speaking of Mustaine, his tenure in the band was short-lived. A gifted guitar player and songwriter, the narrative has been that Mustaine's drinking was largely responsible for his departure. However, in my opinion, it was most likely his domineering personality and ego that got him sacked. In a band with two already massive egos, it most likely would have led to the implosion of Metallica, with Hetfield himself saying that he, Lars and Mustaine trying to drive the ship would have simply been a quote, big triangulated mess. However, there is no doubt that Mustaine's issues with drugs and alcohol was a large contributing factor for his dismissal, namely his violent temper. Hetfield often referred to himself as a violent drunk, and while I don't doubt that he was destructive and could have indeed picked many a fight while under the influence, he was never really known as a tough guy. Mustaine, on the other hand, was well trained in the martial arts, was a talented athlete, and had an upbringing that made Hetfield's look like something from the Brady Bunch. Now, this may be me playing amateur psychologist here, but I often wonder if even a small factor of Mustaine's dismissal had something to do with Hetfield wanting to preserve his position as the group's dominant alpha male. I'm not saying James was a coward, far from it, but in a physical altercation, I believe most people would have put their money on Mustaine, love him or hate him. After Dave Mustaine was kicked out of the band and replaced by former Exodus axe slinger Kirk Hammett, the first stable lineup of the band's history had been established. The band released their debut album, Kill 'Em All, in 1983 under Metal Blade Records. This album has been credited as one of the very first and certainly most influential thrash metal albums ever. For those who don't know, thrash metal is, in a very brief nutshell, a metal subgenre that combined the musicality of the new wave of British heavy metal, bands like Iron Maiden and Judas Priest, with the speed and ferocity of punk, while adopting a more aggressive vocal delivery and darker lyricism. Kill 'Em All, out of the band's first 5 classic albums, is by far the most primitive. The sound of a band finding their feet and their sound in the primordial stages of a new musical style. Lyrically, it's also very basic and stereotypically metal, with songs about apocalyptic death and destruction, partying and general nihilism lacking the introspection or sophistication of later albums. Shortly after its release, the group embarked on their first tour, the Kill 'Em All for One tour, which the band co-headlined with British metal band Raven. Aside from being the first real taste of life on the road, the tour also helped establish another element of the band's legacy, their penchant for drinking. So excessive was their alcohol intake that the band earned the nickname Alcoholica. In fact, the group was drinking so hard on such consistency that Kirk Hammett claims he can still not remember a large portion of the first tour. The next album in the band's career, Ride the Lightning, saw them take a quantum leap forward in songwriting quality and sophistication. I hate to skim through this one, as it is my favourite Metallica album and one of my all-time favourite albums, and one I will review in long form one day. But this isn't a video about the quality of Metallica songs, or even Hetfield's songwriting ability per se. Lyrically, the album started to show signs of evolving and maturing, however at a slightly slower pace than the music. 2 of the themes which would reoccur on later albums emerged here first, and those are the loss of control, mostly pertaining to death, and mental illness, with tracks like Trapped Under Ice and the title track representing the former, while the ballad Fade to Black expressed the latter. In fairness, Fade to Black was the only song so far present in the band's discography which really gave us an insight into the mind of the lyricist. Written about the band after they had their gear stolen, it gave us our first glimpse inside the man who struggled with feelings of anger, loneliness, and desperation. As 1984 turned into 1986, the band's star began to rise. Their next album, Master of Puppets, was another all-time classic metal album and managed to reach number 27 on the Billboard charts without any music videos or mainstream radio airplay, a gargantuan feat for a band in the 1980s. Master of Puppets took the literal template of Ride the Lightning: 8 songs, a title track, instrumental, a ballad, and a mixture of pure thrash metal, groove metal, melodic metal and hints of progressive metal, and continued to expand upon the sound. While I prefer Ride the Lightning as a whole, there is no doubt that Puppets was a sleeker album. The production, again at the hands of producer Van Rasmussen, was far superior, with more clarity and less reverb. The music was a touch more sophisticated and more melodic also, while Hetfield's lyrics and vocals, which lagged behind on Kill 'Em All, were now improving and evolving faster than any of the other elements of Metallica. 2 weeks after the release of Puppets, the band embarked on a worldwide tour, which lasted a year. The first portion of the North American tour was in support of Ozzy Osbourne, a notorious drinker and user whose antics put that of Metallica and most other rock artists to shame. By all accounts, Metallica's live set blew Ozzy out of the water, who was touring his highly contentious, glam-inspired Ultimate Sin album which, while having a few good songs including the classic Shot in the Dark, was his weakest record to that point. Although not quite reaching the levels of depravity of Ozzy, Hetfield did his best to be the very best drunken degenerate he could be. There are many stories regarding Hetfield's inebriated antics. One involved Hetfield wreaking havoc in a hotel room while on tour with Armoured Saint. In his own words, quote, "We were all getting really ripped and started throwing bottles out the window. They were smashing and it sounded really neat. But that soon got boring, so I threw Joey's black and red leather jacket out and it landed in the pool, which, luckily, had its cover on. We went down to get it and on the way back up to the 10th floor, I decided to open the elevator doors between floors. We got stuck for half an hour and everyone is freaking out and I started shouting, 'Get us the... out of here.' We finally get up to the 10th floor and by now I'm pretty mad, so I see this fire extinguisher hanging on the wall. So I kinda took it down and started squirting people with it. This carbon dioxide or some kinda was coming out of it." There were other such instances such as Hetfield trashing an entire trailer, trying to fight Kerrang! Magazine journalists, and getting arrested for scaling the roof of a movie theatre in London. Quote, "I got arrested for destruction of property," he said in Mick Wall's Enter Night, a biography of Metallica. "I was kicking the lights down on people. It was just one of those things we had to do when we were drunk." Hetfield's antics were sophomoric, often aggressive but relatively harmless. Along with his shy and reserved nature, the scars of his youth probably led him to drink, and definitely manifested themselves in some of his more egregious drunken behaviour. Even still, with every album, tour, and roar from the crowd, you could see James maturing and growing in confidence. If the scars weren't going to be addressed and healed properly, they looked to be at least sufficiently callousing over. On September 27, 1986, at around 7 AM on Sweden's E4 highway just north of the city of Ljungby, Metallica's tour bus was making its journey to Copenhagen when it began swerving out of control. Unable to regain control, the bus toppled over, crashing to a halt. Confused, frightened, and disorientated, the members of Metallica, their crew, and the driver climbed out of the broken windows to escape the totaled bus. Screams and worried chatter from the band and crew could be heard from the scene of the crash, with one exception. One voice was conspicuously absent. That voice was Cliff Burton's. When the bus flipped over, Cliff was ejected from the vehicle which, tragically, subsequently landed on him, killing him. The driver blamed a patch of dry ice for the crash. Confused and in shock, Hetfield walked for miles across the stretch of travelled highway looking for dry ice. Convinced there was none, Hetfield returned to confront the driver, who maintained his assurance at the existence of it, while an enraged Hetfield was convinced that there was existence of a scent of alcohol on the driver's breath. Regardless of who was right or who was wrong, Cliff was gone. Cliff was the oldest member of the group. He had the calmest demeanour, and while his songwriting contributions to the group have been somewhat embellished throughout the history of Rose-Tinted Glasses, he was the one who introduced harmony and theory to the band's music. Moreover, he became something of a de facto older brother to James. James, who being immature and quick to anger, would have benefited from the more serene demeanour of Burton. And for a man with abandonment issues who, by his own admission, sought family in music and his band, the loss of such a figure would not only have been devastating, but would have reopened all those old wounds, fresher and more painful than before. When asked how he and the rest of the band dealt with Burton's death, Hetfield said, quote, "We drank a lot, and then when Cliff passed away, it was doubled, you know? Took twice as much to stuff it down. And I never, ever really grieved. We just went back out, started touring again, and that was supposedly the remedy to shake it off and to get back on the horse, all the cliches." How long did it take the band to get back on the horse? 43 days. It took them 43 days from the moment Cliff died to fly back to the States, bury their bandmate, audition dozens of potential replacements, pick a new bassist, and get back on tour. On November 8th of the same year, the band played their first show with new bassist Jason Newsted in Reseda, California. A week later, the band would fly out to Japan, and then on to Australia, Europe, and back to North America again for 3 more months of touring. Time to reflect was minimal. Time to grieve was non-existent. However, time was of the essence when it came to capitalising on the success of the Master of Puppets album. The album peaked at number 29 on the Billboard 100 and cracked the top 20 in 8 different countries, an astonishing feat for an underground thrash metal band with no music videos or significant radio airplay at the time. From a business perspective, it made perfect sense. However, from a mental health one, especially as far as Hetfield was concerned, it made none whatsoever. As I said, Hetfield and Burton were close. Speaking on their friendship, James had this to say: "Cliff and I really identified with each other. We liked a lot of the same stuff, same music. He was into more southern rock, Lynyrd Skynyrd, stuff like that which I love. He loved being out in nature, hiking, camping, shooting guns, drinking beer. Him and I identified with each other." Hetfield's inability, or at least his unwillingness, to deal with Burton's death correctly wasn't simply due to his tumultuous childhood and wariness of people. It was directly correlated to his religious upbringing. Quote, "That was another part of Christian Science," Hetfield said. "There were no funerals, no grieving period where you're able to cry and get support. It was just, okay, the shell is dead, the spirit's gone, and move on in life. So when Cliff died, there was a funeral, but I didn't feel the vibe." There were many things that Hetfield, the band, and their management had no time for. What there was always time for, and what there continued to be time for now, with continued dependence, was drinking. As Hetfield bluntly put it, after Cliff died he, quote, just drank harder, drank it away. Was Hetfield fun to be around when he drank? Definitely not, Hetfield said. I would get pretty violent. There'd be the happy stage, then it would get ugly and the world is, and you. I became the clown, then the punk anarchist after that, wanting to smash everything and hurt people. I'd get into fights. Hetfield is one of the most gifted songwriters in metal history. Yet, at 23 years of age, he still hadn't learned how to control his drinking, or come to terms with his own emotions. Hetfield was one of the greatest riff writers in metal history. He was also one of the finer lyricists in the genre. And while many hardcore Metallica fans drew a hard line between the band's first 3 albums and subsequent releases, and while many, like myself, view the duo of Ride the Lightning and Master of Puppets as their finest musical hour, lyrically, Hetfield would only become more mature, poetic, and insightful over the next decade, which meant 2 things. 1, better lyrics, and 2, an insight into the mind of a frontman unwilling to admit his true feelings directly. It's becoming exceedingly difficult not to talk about the band's albums and their place in music as they evolved and became more mainstream. So let me just say this. Their next album, And Justice for All, was a great album, but one which arguably fell short of the sky-high metallic standards of their previous 2 albums. While the Black Album was significantly better, becoming one of the band's greatest albums. Justice saw the band at their most progressive and uncompromising, while Black saw them strive for more streamlined, radio-friendly sound, which just so happened to inspire some of their finest songwriting. There, that's my opinion on those 2 albums. Now back to the subject at hand. 1988's And Justice for All is one of the group's most divisive albums from a sonic perspective. Some love the razor-sharp mechanical guitar sound and blasting drums, while others hate its lack of bass, bottom end, and harsher mix. One thing is for certain though, this was by far the band's most diverse and articulate record from a lyrical standpoint up until that point. While almost every song on the previous 3 albums dealt with the subject of death directly, Justice covered a variety of topics from the destruction of the environment to the American judicial system to biases in the media, along with the typical subjects of death and war. The most revealing song on the album lyrically, however, was not a single or one of the album's better known tracks. Rather, it was the album Closer, the fastest, heaviest and trashiest song on the record, Dyer's Eve. Dyer's Eve was the first lyric Hetfield ever penned that dealt directly with his upbringing. Although the narrator is anonymous and no names or specifics are mentioned, the lyrics pertaining to abandonment, denial and the sheltering of the youth all pertain to his childhood. Lyrics like, "Dear mother, dear father, what is this hell you have put me through? Pushed onto me what's wrong or right, hidden from this thing that they call life. Every thought I think you disapprove, curator, dictator, always censoring my every move," are thinly veiled references to the Christian Science upbringing that was forced upon Hetfield. While lyrics like, "Innocence, torn from me without your shelter, barred reality, I'm living blindly, I'm in hell without you, cannot cope without you too, shock to the world that I see, innocent victim, please rescue me," sees Hetfield admonishing his father for abandoning him, his mother for refusing to treat her illness, and the fear and sadness he felt upon losing both. It was by far Hetfield's most personal lyrical moment, the kind of which will become more commonplace and, frankly, more well crafted as the albums rolled on. 2 of the lines in the final verse, which read, "I'm seething, I'm bleeding, ripping wounds in me that never heal," are some of the most visceral, and foreshadowed a lyrical theme which would reappear on later albums, open bleeding wounds. However, unlike many other metal bands which pen lyrics in the form of obvious cliches, these wounds were in no way physical. 3 years later, the band would release their 5th studio album, the eponymously titled Metallica, or the Black Album as it is more commonly known. The impact this album had musically and culturally, at least within the heavy metal genre, is hard to overstate. It reached number 1 on the Billboard charts, while also topping the charts in 9 other countries. As of recording, it has sold over 25 million albums, making it the 21st best-selling album in history. Almost overnight, it transformed them into icons, single-handedly elevating them into the upper echelon of rock and roll, the residual effects of which would guarantee them a future induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and a lifetime of sold-out stadium tours and #1 albums. It is the band's sleekest, most painstakingly produced record to date. Musically, it was a larger-than-life tour de force of hooks, melodies, and state-of-the-art metallic riffing. Lyrically, it saw Hetfield move further away from death, war, and destruction, and continue his journey into more introverted and philosophical lyricism. Many point to Nothing Else Matters as the band's most personal song up until that point. And while it is true that it stands as a wonderful song and Hetfield's most sensitive lyric, this verbal love letter isn't as revelatory as others on the album. With regards to Hetfield's upbringing and personal demons, The Unforgiven and The God That Failed are the two songs which further peel back those layers. The Unforgiven is a ballad which deals with the prospect of a once bright young boy growing old and never fulfilling his potential. He flounders because his life is being run by those around him. The opening verse has Hetfield singing, "New blood joins this earth, and quickly he's subdued. Through constant pain disgrace, the young boy learns their rules." There are other nods to floundered potential, such as "never shined through in what I've shown, won't see what might have been," while the idea of having no control or anonymity, a theme that was, for example, extremely prevalent on Ride the Lightning, can be heard in lines like, "They dedicate their lives to running all of his. He's battled constantly. This fight he cannot win. A tired man they see no longer cares." While this may not seem relevant to the subject of alcoholism, anger, and abandonment that I'm trying to convey in this video, I actually think there are veiled homages to those themes as here in another tracks. Perhaps Dyer's Eve is the best comparison. In Dyer's Eve, a nominee in control is lost in lines like, "Day in and day out, I live my life through you," and "Curator, dictator, always censoring my every move. Children are seen but are not heard. Tear out everything inspired." So the way I see it, whereas Hetfield wrote Dyer's Eve directly about his experiences in childhood, The Unforgiven is about the potential future consequences of his inhibitions as a result of his trauma. The God That Failed is the first song that focuses solely on the loss of his mother. He laments her blind fate through lyrics like, "Pride you took, pride you feel, pride that you felt when you kneel. I see faith in your eyes, never you hear the discouraging lies," while acknowledging the ineffectiveness of blind faith and the subsequent spread of cancer when he sings, "It feeds, it grows, it clouds all that you will know. Deceit, deceive, decide just what you believe. Broken is the promise betrayal, the healing hand held back by the deepened nail. Follow the God that failed." For the record, I'm not dissing Christian Science or any religion or faith system for that matter. And in fact, even Hetfield's stance on faith and spirituality has softened over the years. I'm just commenting on the frustration a child must have felt knowing a parent died without seeking any viable medical treatment. Aside from the album itself and the subsequent multi-million-dollar tours that followed, we got two video releases as a result of the monster that was the Black Album. The first was the live album Live, Binge and Purge, a CD VHS box set of 3 Metallica shows, one in Seattle from the Injustice for All tour and 2 from the Black Album tour, one in Mexico City and one in San Diego. For me, this was Metallica at their live peak. At this point, not only had they their 5 best albums, and only 5 best albums, to choose from when compiling their setlist, but they sounded so good live. Better than they ever had before and, regrettably, than they ever would again. Chief among these sonic improvements was Hetfield's voice. James's vocal performances on both Justice and Black were the best of his career. He had perfected his Metallica bark, while also added a control, power and flair for melody, which wasn't present on the first 3 albums, and which would diminish in later releases. This vocal prowess translated into their live performances from this era too. On top of this, Hetfield had developed quite the stage presence. The skinny kid who struggled to look audiences in the eye in the band's infancy had filled out into a stocky, confident, outspoken frontman who commanded the audience's attention. The second release was a year and a half in the life of Metallica, a fascinating 2-part documentary which chronicled the making of the Black Album as well as the 3-year tour that followed. Seeing how the album was meticulously crafted and getting a peek behind the curtain as to how a live juggernaut is maintained and executed made for some really fun viewing. To make a long story short, the album, tours, live box set and documentary captured the band and Hetfield at the very top of their game. It also captured something else. Watch either of the Metallica live performances or the scenes between interviews in the second part of a 1.5-year documentary, and you are more than likely going to see Hetfield with a beer in his hand. The tales of the band's alcoholic tendencies were mere legend and hearsay in the early days due to the lack of social media and immediate availability of recording equipment. But now that the band were at the top of the popular music heap, with camera crews eagerly following their every move, we could now see, if not the consequences of his drinking, at least the frequency of it. This, coupled with his new raw, confessional lyrics, gave us the first glimpse of who Hetfield was underneath the millions of album sales, millions of dollars, crushing riffs, and larger-than-life persona. A man in pain. The impact of the Black Album and the contentious decade that followed have been thoroughly documented by fans, journalists, and, well, documentarians. For many fans, the musical departure from thrash metal to the more streamlined heavy metal seen on the Black Album was a tough pill to swallow. However, the album still maintained that heavy metal music aesthetic, and few could deny the songwriting prowess displayed on the record. Moreover, as seen on the two aforementioned videos, the band maintained their presence, look, and attitude throughout the making of and touring in support of the Black Album. When the band returned to the spotlight 5 years later, they did so with a completely different look and sound. Sporting short hair, eyeliner, and makeup, the band's 1996 album Load was more akin to hard rock or blues rock with its loose riffing, slower tempos, and more subdued overdrive. As for Hetfield's contribution, aside from being the primary songwriter, his vocals had evolved from his trademark bark into a more rock and roll snarl, while the subject matters of death and destruction had almost been completely abandoned, at least in their previous stereotypically overt fashion. This was the album that saw fans of the group abandon them in droves, unable to stomach their drastic change in direction. However, out of every album in their back catalogue, this is the one that has grown on me the most over recent years. Sure, it's got nothing on Ride, Master or Black, but much of the songwriting is clever, and some of the melodies are among the band's best. I still maintain that if they'd shortened the track list and added the few good songs that were on the following year's album sequel Reload, something they avoided due to a record company dispute which I cannot get into here for the sake of time and your sanity, this could have been one of the band's strongest albums, on par even perhaps with an album like Justice. The thing that draws me most to the album though are its lyrics. If the Black Album was Hetfield's finest hour as a vocalist, then Load was his finest as a lyricist. Approaching his mid-30s having lived through childhood traumas and unimaginable success, as the non-stop cycle of touring and recording which dominated his 20s gave way to some more free time post-Black Album, there is no doubt that a more mature and experienced Hetfield would have had some time for growth and, most importantly, some serious retrospection and self-analysis. During this time, James also reunited with his estranged father, Virgil. The relationship would be awkward and tentative until Virgin's death in 1996, and although this afforded James the opportunity for some reconciliation, you get the impression that he never got full closure for what had occurred between he and his father. The lyrical content on Load doesn't come across to me as the words of a man willing to fully accept and attempt to heal his psychological wounds. Instead, they're the words of a man, perhaps for the first time, directly acknowledging them, not solely through metaphor, not camouflage between songs about hard partying and violence, but through actual admittance and vulnerability. On Injustice for All, Hetfield admonished both parents on Dyer's Eve in an angry tirade. On the Black Album, he criticises the Christian Science religion as culpable in his mother's death. Not quite as angry, yet still confrontational. On Load, Hetfield is, quite frankly, looking for help. Not in the seeking a $1,000 an hour therapist kind of way, but more in a man desperately searching for an antidote to his inner pain without directly asking for it kind of way. The fourth song on the album, Until It Sleeps, is indicative of this state of mind, as the opening two lines are both a question and an admittance of suffering. Quote, "Where do I take this pain of mine? I run but it stays right by my side." This is the kind of vulnerability and introspection that's lacking on earlier Metallica albums. Even a song like The Unforgiven, which Hetfield admitted was one of the most personal songs he ever wrote, is sung strictly from a third-person perspective. The whipping boy and old man who lives life unforgiven may be Hetfield himself, but he still assigns these feelings and experiences to an unnamed protagonist. On Until It Sleeps, he asks where he should take his pain and confesses that he, the narrator, cannot escape it. The opening chorus, which goes, "So tear me open, pour me out, there's things inside that scream and shout, and the pain still hates me, so hold me until it sleeps," uses the metaphorical idea of being wounded or of tearing oneself open to reveal what lies within, the type of which first appeared on tracks like Dyer's Eve. Here, it's not only the central theme of this track, but appears in other songs across the album. This is not Hetfield coming out of the closet, so to speak, with his emotions. This would occur 7 years later on a certain documentary. This is him asking the listener, his band, anyone, to do it for him. The song also brings up the almost biblical concept of being dirty or impure, especially in the second chorus when Hetfield substitutes in the lines, "And the dirt still stains me, so wash me until I'm clean." The refrain of "It grips you, so hold me, it stains you, so hold me, it hates you, so hold me, it holds you, so hold me until it sleeps," is another reoccurring lyrical thread that can be seen throughout the album. The need for relief from his suffering, or protection from emotions or revelations which may only be coming to the surface properly for the first time in his life. Many believe that this song is about Hetfield's mother directly, and that the pain and dirt inside is a metaphor for her cancer. While I can see where they're coming from, I personally believe that it's about James himself. It is true that a significant cause of his enduring pain may be the loss of his mother, something he couldn't fully reconcile with, along with Cliff's death, until he entered therapy years later. Another song, The Torn Within, again uses this imagery of a man being wounded to convey the idea of being emotionally troubled. While not quite as poetic as other lyrics found on the album and nowhere near as musically appealing, the second half of the album is substantially worse than the first from a songwriting perspective, reinforcing my belief, and the belief of others, that the album as a whole was far too long. The chorus's refrain of "I am the secret, I am the sin, I am the guilty, I am the torn within" is pretty self-explanatory, conveying the idea once again of being unpure and unwhole. While the opening line of "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned, find me guilty of the life I feel within" harkens back to the lyrical themes of parental strife, which reared its head back on justice. On the subject, the ballad Mama Said is Hetfield's most direct song about his mother, the likes of which he would never write again. Now that you know the history between James and his mother, lyrics like "I left home at an early age, of what I heard was wrong, I never asked forgiveness, but what is said is done" should make perfect sense to you. However, when James sings lines like "Apron strings around my neck, the mark that still remains," and "But you gave me your emptiness, now I take to my grave," there is a personal depth and darkness there that I don't feel capable or comfortable with analysing. However, I think we can all understand the sentiment, even if we cannot fully understand the lyrical origin. But by far the most revelatory song on the album, as well as being one of Metallica's most underrated songs, and my personal favourite James Hetfield lyric of all time, is Bleeding Me. For me, this is the song that best encapsulates Hetfield's mindset at the time, while also tying in all the metaphorical devices, feelings of searching and desperation, as well as the man's struggle with alcoholism, into one song as succinctly as possible. For evidence of this, here is a quote by James Hetfield from a 2001 interview with Playboy magazine, where he discusses the song. "Around the time of Load, I felt like I wanted to stop drinking. Maybe I'm missing out on something. Everyone else seems so happy all the time. I want to get happy. I'd planned my life around a hangover. The Misfits are playing in town Friday night, so Saturday is hangover day. I lost a lot of days in my life. Going to therapy for a year, I learned a lot about myself. There's a lot of things that scar you when you're growing up, and you don't know why. The song Bleeding Me is about that. I was trying to bleed out all the bad, get the evil out. While I was going through therapy, I discovered some ugly stuff in there, a dark spot. What stands out to me the most about this track, other than its lyrical and melodic quality, is the opening verse. When Hetfield sings, "I'm digging my way to something better. I'm pushing to stay with something better. there is a hopefulness that is conspicuously absent on the rest of the album. In many ways, this makes the words on the following verse, which read, "I'm sowing the seeds I take for granted. This thorn in my side is from the tree I planted. It tears me and I bleed," all the more melancholic. The reason for this is because this is the only song on the album where Hetfield makes a promise to lead a better life, where he vows to find personal peace. However, mere seconds later, before the first chorus even arrives, he's already reneging on that promise. He acknowledges that although he wants something more from life, his habits and behaviours, or seeds, are still, at this juncture, too much to overcome. Yet he still has the intelligence and awareness to acknowledge how they are destroying him, or tearing him and making him bleed, so to speak. I think of all the songs on Load, this is the most honest and direct admission of Hetfield's alcoholism, and how self-destructive it is. All remaining motifs and themes can be found in the song's chorus, which goes, "Caught under wheels roll, I take the leash on bleeding me. Can't stop to save my soul. I take the leash that's leading me. I'm bleeding me, I can't take it." And the interlude, "I am the beast that feeds the beast. I am the blood, I am release. Come make me pure, bleed me a cure." I think it's telling that the song ends with a refrain of the opening verse. I may be wrong, but I believe this may be the only Metallica song that ends by calling back to the opening verse. Whether this was done to highlight the message of the opening lyrics, or because James and Lars felt it sounded better arrangement-wise, is up to anyone's guess. But hearing the song fade out with Hetfield crooning, "I'm pushing to stay with something better," is powerful, especially given what we know about the man now. I really feel like Load was simultaneously the biggest missed opportunity of the band's career, and one of their most unfairly maligned. I understand stretching the material across 2 albums to fulfill their deal with Elektra Records, a label they were unhappy with. However, I wish for the sake of their legacy they condensed it, as well as follow-up Reload, into a shorter album of superior quality. At the same time, I think all the bells and whistles around the band change in direction and imagery, along with their increased commercial viability, distracted fans from some of the quality on display here. Again, no matter what form this album would have taken, it never would have reached the artistic highs of their very best work. The only reason I'm spending so much time on it is because the lyrical content is so pertinent to the subject at hand, and just so happens to be, in my opinion, Hetfield's crowning achievement as a lyricist. A lot would happen in the world of Metallica over the next 7 years, most of which would be negative. Scandals, court cases, subpar albums, and defections would severely rock the band's foundation, damage their reputation, and almost destroy the group entirely. As for James, these next 7 years would be the most vital of his life, a time of pain and personal growth that would see him confronted with personal ultimatums that would make or break both his personal and professional life. However, with Load becoming the band's second album to top the Billboard 100 and a slew of sold-out arenas to perform in, neither he, the band, nor the fans could have foreseen any of this, at least not yet. However, as millions of young, angry metalheads were listening to the album's closing lyrics, "Hear me, and if I close my mind in fear, please pry it open, see me, and if my face becomes sincere, beware, hold me, and when I start to come undone, stitch me together, save me, and when you see me strut, remind me of what left this outlaw torn." In hindsight, the clues were already there. The late 90s and early noughties were simultaneously the most barren and crucial in the lives of Hetfield and the rest of Metallica. In 1997, James married Francesca Tomasi. Francesca was the former costumier for the band, and had dated Hetfield since 1993, before deciding to tie the knot 4 years later. That same year, Metallica released their 7th studio album Reload, and although it became their 3rd consecutive #1 album, it sounded like exactly what it was, the leftovers of Load. Aside from the opening tracks Fuel and The Memory Remains, both of which are on par with anything on Load, and are actually the 2 most enduring songs from either album as it pertains to live performances and fan popularity, the rest of the album was mostly subpar. The band would release 2 more albums prior to the turn of the millennium. In 1998, they released Garage Inc., a collection of both previously and newly recorded covers. This was an enjoyable, if unessential, double album, and while some of the covers weren't spectacular, there were a few gems, including Bob Seger's Turn the Page, Tin Lizzy's Whiskey in the Jar, and The Misfits' Last Caress. In 1999, they released the humorously titled S&M, a live concert performance with the San Francisco Symphony Orchestra. As a performance, truthfully it was mixed. Don't get me wrong, both the band and the orchestra played very well. It's just that some of the arrangements were lackluster. Again, don't get me wrong, conductor and composer Michael Kamen was an extremely talented individual and did the best he could. It just feels like the song selection could have been better, as many of the songs they chose to play didn't leave a lot of room sonically for orchestral arrangements. The following year, Metallica became one of the first bands to file a lawsuit against Napster, a website which was one of the pioneers of musical file sharing, after they discovered that their track I Disappear had been receiving radio airplay after being leaked online. This drew much ire from a substantial percentage of their own fanbase, as well as the music-loving public at large, who viewed Metallica as greedy for trying to shut down Napster and any other site which shared their music for free. Given what we know now about the ease and commonality of the illegal downloading and streaming of music, something most people of a certain generation are at least partially guilty of, and the effect it still has on the music industry today, Metallica and the other artists were arguably rightfully protective of the proprietorship of their music, and by extension their livelihoods. And yeah, I guess the record companies too, to an extent. And regardless of how you feel about the integrity or avarice of the record industry, it's hard to argue with the free usership of any good or service of any kind, at least in principle. To the credit of Metallica drummer Lars Ulrich, often the most polarising and hated of the four members of the band, regardless of the iteration, he put himself out there front and centre as the de facto mouthpiece of the band with regards to their fight against Napster, as he did for most other affairs related to Metallica. The consequence of this is that he took the lion's share of abuse, ridicule and venom that may have been directed at the band as a whole. This not only made him the bad guy in this instance, but went a long way in cementing him as the villain of the band, a greedy, untalented drummer who values his millions over his artistry, a reputation he still carries to this day, rightly or wrongly. There is much to admire about James Hetfield. His uncanny songwriting ability, his proficiency as a rhythm guitar player and singer, his penmanship, his humble, calm demeanour. However, this was the time when some of the flaws in his personality became apparent, and the first sign of this was during the Napster trial. When asked in an interview about Lars' prominence during this time, Hetfield said this, quote, "He is the figurehead for the band. He likes talking. He likes being out there. I'm extremely proud of what we did. It had to happen. No artist would stand up except some of the rap artists. We were abandoning the rebel attitude and, man, there couldn't be anything more rebel than that." Now, I should preface this by saying Hetfield is my personal musical hero. Metallica were not the first band I became enamoured with as a youth, with groups like the Beatles and Simon & Garfunkel being the first to spark my passion for the medium. But Metallica, and James specifically, solidified my lifelong love of music and made me want to learn how to play the guitar. In spite of the often negative perception of heavy metal music within the macrocosm of popular music, I would rate Hetfield up there with the likes of McCartney, Wilson and Dylan as a writer, player and performer. That being said, I feel like Hetfield showed a degree of self-preservation and, dare I say, even cowardice when it came to the Napster issue. Hetfield often postures as a tough guy through his presentation and rhetoric. A big, tattooed frontiersman who plays heavy metal music, hunts his own game, and often reminisces about street fighting in his younger days. However, putting Lars out front and centre under the guise of him enjoying the spotlight always rubbed me the wrong way. Here is a man in your musical group, championing a mutual cause which will benefit you both monetarily, and you're happy to let him go out alone to fight the battle and take the majority of the hits, while also having the gall to say years later, with the luxury of hindsight, that you were, quote, extremely proud of what we did, while touting yourself as a rebel. This is James essentially taking equal credit for something he had minimal real involvement with. Regardless of how you feel about the Napster situation, or Hetfield's involvement in it, there is no debate that as the new millennium rolled on, Metallica as a band were at their lowest point in well over a decade. The mid-90s saw the near extinction of old school heavy metal, with only a select few bands, Metallica chief among them, able to weather the storm of grunge, Britpop and alternative rock that had wrestled the hard rock crown from the metal bands that dominated the 1980s. And even though Metallica survived this period, it would be foolish to suggest that their toning down of their image and the streamlining of their sound had nothing to do with the change of musical direction in rock and roll. To be fair, a new form of heavy metal had emerged in the late 90s, the aptly christened nu metal, which combined the heavy metal sound, additional groove and hip-hop influences, providing a much less complex, much more palatable style of metal music which propelled the likes of Slipknot, Korn and Limp Bizkit into the charts and stadiums around the world. The declining quality of their musical output, the declining record sales, their diminishing relevancy not only within popular music, but within the genre they helped to evolve and popularise, their increasingly negative reputation in the court of popular opinion, and the inner turmoil within the camp left the band's future and their very identity hanging uneasily in the realm of uncertainty and, potentially, obscurity. As the world rang in the second year of the 21st century, two things happened that would have had massive and long-lasting impact on the band. Firstly, their bassist of 15 years, Jason Newsted, left the band after becoming increasingly frustrated with the group's unwillingness, or, more specifically, Hetfield's unwillingness, to allow him to pursue other musical projects outside of Metallica. Secondly, James fell back off the wagon. Hard. With the band scheduled to go back into the studio to record their 8th studio album, an album that could make or break a band already on the verge of imploding, James did what any other man in his position and with his dispositions would do. He left his band and his family behind, flying out to Siberia, armed with a hunting rifle and an endless supply of vodka. Life sometimes has a tendency to throw everything at you all at once. In the world of Metallica, it had been nothing but a feast since the release of their 1991 eponymous album. For 10 years, the band enjoyed unmitigated success for a heavy metal outfit, scoring 3 consecutive #1 albums, while becoming the highest earning concert draw in North America. They had, compromises aside, weathered the storm of alternative rock and were poised to surpass 100 million worldwide album sales. In many ways, you could say that the band were overdue a period of famine. The growing decline of the quality of their musical output, the Napster backlash, their growing obscurity within the popular music milieu, along with growing interpersonal band tensions, were all simultaneously putting pressure on the Metallica machine. A once infallible juggernaut that seemingly could not be broken was about to fracture apart, and almost break beyond repair. The first major crack in the foundation occurred on January 17, 2001, when bassist Jason Newsted officially quit the band, citing, quote, "private and personal reasons and the physical damage I have done to myself over the years while playing the music that I love." In reality, Jason had grown increasingly frustrated with his diminutive role in the band's creative process, as well as his inability to pursue other musical projects. Newsted was an exceptionally good bass player, a powerful live presence, arguably the best out of anyone in the entire band's history, and a fan favourite who often gets overlooked in retrospect. However, songwriting-wise, he was just out of his depth. Cliff Burton was the first in the group to introduce musical theory. Ulrich has a gift for arrangement. Hammett has contributed a not so insignificant minority of riffs to the group, and Hetfield was, is, and always will be, the main songwriting talent of the band. In his prime, Hetfield wrote better riffs than any other guitarist in metal, had one of the best ears for melody, and was a more than capable lyricist. All of this meant that Jason essentially got squeezed out of the writing process. So 15 years into his tenure with the group, it is unsurprising, and more than a little understanding, that he would seek other musical avenues to express his creativity. The only problem was that one person stood in his way. It wasn't management, or an excess of live or studio commitments. It wasn't even Lars or Kirk, who both supported Newsted's second band Echo Brain and their imminent debut album. In the 2001 issue of Playboy, Kirk called it a great album, while Lars called it, quote, "a nice record, very bluesy, like a poppier version of Stevie Ray Vaughan stuff," while also adding, "I wouldn't be able to look him in the eye and go, you can't put that record out. That's not who I am as a person." No, the person who stood in his way was James Hetfield. When broached about the same topic, James had this to say: "We just disagree about side projects. Fans have always viewed Metallica as something they can rely on. We're always there, always strong, and that's a band. We've been the same guys since day one, essentially. The only way you can get out of this band is if you die. When you say Metallica, you know who that is. Lars, James, Kirk, and what's that guy? Jason. When someone does a side project, it takes away from the strength of Metallica. Where would it end? Does he start touring with it? Does he sell shirts? Is it his band? That's the part I don't like. It's like cheating on your wife in a way. We're all married to Metallica. Married to each other. It should be noted that the band were on a hiatus during this time. When asked how Jason should best fill his time during this period, Hetfield humorously, yet callously replied, "I don't know, I'm not his travel agent." It should also be noted that during his 15 years in the band, Jason had never quite been viewed as an equal. Partially due to him coming in right after Burton's death, partially because he never quite fit in with the group on a purely human level. In any event, Hetfield forbade him from releasing the Echo Brain album, and even in the interview, when probed about the topic, Newsted was quick to divert attention away from this pregnant matter. "I won't go there," he said. "We have to change the subject." The words of a man equally in fear as he was frustrated, both of which would lead to his departure before this interview was even published. Regardless of how you feel about James Hetfield or Metallica, it's almost impossible to argue that this was a good look for James. In fact, I would say he came across as a total ass. Hetfield is often regarded as a stoic, no BS individual. However, in the same breath, people would describe him as wise, patient, insightful, and compassionate. This interview showed the worst traits of the man. Selfish, controlling, mean-spirited, and angry. Also hypocritical. James had done his fair share of collaborations during Jason's stint in the group, and while he never released a full album with a side project, the fact that he allowed himself to do it while preventing Jason, who was a far less prominent creative force in the group, never sat right with me. There is no other way to sugarcoat it. The biggest reason for Jason's departure was Hetfield. Jason looked up to James, much in the same way James admired Cliff. However, whereas there was a mutual love and respect between James and Burton, Hetfield never fully respected Jason. That Jason was able to tolerate this for 15 years is either a testament to his patience and love of the band, or his love of money, or maybe a combination of the two. In any event, James's scolding of the near 40-year-old Newsted, his supposed colleague, was the straw that ultimately broke the camel's back. In the wake of Jason's departure, the band opted, as they had after Cliff's passing, to carry on without pause or reflection, with longtime producer Bob Rock in tow as the temporary bassist. In Newsted's wake, the band were left in turmoil. Interpersonal tensions were at an all-time high, creativity was at an all-time low, while Hetfield continued to drink. However, another event was set to take place, one which at the time must have seemed totally disastrous and counterproductive, but which would, in hindsight, be viewed as a moment of incredible serendipity, a moment of recorded history which would stand, even today, as the greatest thing to bear the Metallica name since the Black Album. Something which would redefine and perhaps even save the band, and one which would, at least in part, be responsible for saving and changing James Hetfield's life forever. In April of 2001, documentary filmmakers Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky started shooting what they assumed at the time would be a film documenting the making of Metallica's 8th studio album. This would, at worst, be another fly-on-the-wall piece about the making of an album by a high-profile group, a dime a dozen in popular music film. At best, it would be just that, but morphed, with just enough drama and embellishment, into a Rocky-esque musical comeback story. 2 years later, when the dust had settled and the filming stopped, Berlinger and Sinofsky had shot what would arguably become the greatest rock and roll documentary ever made. When you think of rock and roll documentaries, biographies and tell-alls, a few things normally come to mind. The glorification of musical creativity, the pomp and circumstance of the live show, the excesses behind closed doors. In other words, sex, drugs and rock and roll. Some Kind of Monster is the antithesis of all of the above. It showed the band at their lowest point, down a member, constant infighting, primarily between James and Lars, and at a creative low in a musical landscape no longer conducive to their style of music. For the first time ever, in a world that hadn't quite yet been overrun by the pervasiveness of the internet and social media, fans could see Metallica not as four larger-than-life metal legends playing some of the genre's finest music, but as three middle-aged, flawed and fractured men, as susceptible to selfishness, weakness, vulnerability and ugliness as everyone else. Initially, James was uncomfortable with the filming process, but as Phil Towle, the performance coach they hired to keep the band together and hopefully repair the fissures within it, said so elegantly of the process, the issue they had to overcome was not whether or not the cameras were on, but whether or not they were willing to risk being seen by the people. The film starts with the band in the studio putting together the songs that would eventually become their 8th studio album. It highlights each member's personalities and idiosyncrasies. However, it's Hetfield's that are most prominent and important, not just due to the fact that he is, in many ways, the focal point of the story, but also because while Lars and Kirk remain more or less the same people at the end of the movie as they were at the start, James undergoes something of a spiritual transformation. But before we can reach that point, we're shown James as he was throughout his entire career with the band up until that point. A hellraiser with a drink never too far away from his hands, driving down the highway in a crazy open-top car with a skull stick shift, who's quick to raise his voice when confronted and shield himself from any kind of vulnerability. A notable example of this is when Lars expresses his worry that the cameras may detract from the band's usual intimacy. Hetfield dismisses this with a laugh, saying, "What the F are you talking about?" Early on in the movie, we see James return from the hunting trip that I've alluded to a few times in this video. For 2 weeks, all the man did was drink vodka and work on lyrics. In a retrospective interview, James speaks remorsefully about abruptly leaving his family to go hunting and drinking. Quote, "I can be a real ass about it. By the way, I'm going to Russia for 2 weeks. That's the most I've ever missed my family." He also revealed that because of the trip, he missed his son's first birthday. Tying in with all of this is one of the first recording and writing sessions, where James sings through a version of a song titled Temptation. And while the track would never ultimately end up getting released, the lyrics and accompanying montage best encapsulate Hetfield's hedonistic lifestyle. James sings, "Temptation sucks my soul, temptation fill no hole, F you up, temptation, no, I can't say no, temptation let me be," as a video of drinking, posturing and groupies play atop the singer's crooning. These sessions soon become tumultuous though, as James and Lars cannot seem to coexist on anything. A humorous squabble over a drum beat and a guitar riff turns into a more serious discussion about the film and their group therapy sessions with Phil Towle, with Hetfield going on the offensive. Quote, "All next week is therapy. Do we have to do that? Can we sack Phil?" As the argument escalated, an agitated Hetfield stands up, walks out of the room, slams the door and leaves. Soon after this confrontation, James Hetfield entered rehab. He wouldn't share the same room with his bandmates for a year. In an interview with Classic Rock magazine, Hetfield pointed to the Siberian hunting trip as the turning point that led him to sobriety. Quote, "We were in this 4-foot high chicken shack in the middle of nowhere, 4-hour helicopter ride out of this little town, drinking vodka. There was nothing else to drink. That was the end for me." While Hetfield faded to almost complete anonymity within the band during this time, his absence was more than a little conspicuous. James has, and always will be, the heart and soul of Metallica, and this was never more apparent than during his hiatus from the group. Now, as mentioned, James is not perfect, and I'm going to hammer him a bit more in a little while, but, as shown in the documentary, the band were basically creatively impotent without him. His sabbatical also casts a larger shadow of doubt over the future of the band, its members, and its crew than had ever been cast before. Larger and more ominous than the proliferation of a different musical climate, a fight with Napster, the departure of Jason Newsted, or even the death of Cliff Burton. One of the most interesting things about Hetfield's departure, as it pertains to some kind of monster, was his fellow bandmates' assessment of him as a man both during this time and in general. His former right-hand man on stage, Jason Newsted, was bitter and scathing, reflecting on Hetfield's controlling nature and insistence of blind loyalty to the band at the expense of other musical avenues. Jason still claimed, and truthfully to his credit, that, quote, There's no way that this thing I was doing could affect the monster of Metallica. While adding that the group therapy sessions were lame and weak, while also questioning as to why, quote, we could not get together, the biggest heavy band of all time. We can't get over this. Kirk was more pragmatic and less judgmental of his bandmate, and gave what was probably the most objective and level-headed assessment of what James was going through, saying, quote, our sessions with Phil really stirred up a lot of things in James that he felt he needed to address. Whenever you check yourself into rehab, they don't just focus on the fact that you're an alcoholic, they go way deeper. Unsurprisingly, Lars, who is the most outspoken and uncompromising member of Metallica, and also the closest in the band to James while being his polar opposite and ego equivalent, was the most hurt and judgmental out of anybody. In one scene, he laments Hetfield's masculine posturings, claiming that when they were in different company, Hetfield would posture and act like he didn't care about him, while revealing that during the recording of Ride the Lightning, he and James went out and had 42 beers, something that was perhaps embellished for a dramatic effect, and that it was only at that point that James could bring himself to tell the drummer that he loved him. Even still, Lars offered up the most truthful assessment of both Hetfield's character and his alcoholism when he said, I always thought he was a softer, more compassionate person than he allowed himself to be. All the depressive things that showed up as a result of the alcohol was just that he found it difficult to communicate from the heart and not hide behind all these different fronts, the macho BS and all that stuff. I want to help him. I want to be there for him, to be the best person that he can be. A year later, James re-emerged in a, quote, very different place from where he was pre-rehab. This very different place brought out the best and worst in his personality. Unfortunately, we were exposed to a lot of the bad early on. In his first meeting with the band and management, he claims that he feels pressured by the filming, which may or may not have ceased depending on Hetfield's own sensitivities, as well as the enormity of Metallica, and that he doesn't like being the centre of attention all the time. However, whether inadvertently or purposely, he becomes just that almost immediately after returning. He stresses the need for him to prioritise his own life, family, and well-being over the band, all of which is reasonable. Sure, he didn't afford Jason the same freedom, but to be fair, this is post-rehab Hetfield, a man who is, as we will soon see after I'm done crapping all over him, far different than the one who first entered rehab. This causes immediate strife between him and Lars, who suggests that, quote, if Metallica collectively decides to do this, then collectively we can make it work. The priority is the collective, until the people said that the priority is the individual. As far as prioritising various cogs of Metallica over the collective, he maintains that only Hetfield has expressed this desire. I haven't said that, he says, before pointing to Kirk and Bob, and letting the frontman know that neither had they. One of the residual byproducts of Some Kind of Monster was the further vilification of Lars Ulrich. And while there is much to dislike about him in this film, his general pompous demeanour, his childishness, his borderline sociopathic businessman-like approach to the business, one thing we cannot admonish him for is his honesty and his willingness to adhere to a set of principles or ideals, righteous or not. A good example of where Lars should have come across as sympathetic and where James should have come across as negative, and perhaps even arrogant, were the various rules and parameters that came with Hetfield's recovery schedule. One of these, which became perhaps the biggest point of contention between he and Lars, was that he was only allowed to work from noon to 4. Now this by itself isn't a massive deal. Sure, only a multimillionaire with a high-priced therapist will be afforded the luxury, both clinically and in practicality, to adhere to such a reduced work schedule. But look, it's his life and his money, so he's entitled to live it and spend it as he pleases. The problem is that he imposes this schedule on the other members of the band, and tries to forbid them from working on, or even listening to, material in his absence. This didn't sit well with me when I first watched it nearly 20 years ago, and it still irks me to this day. I think it shows the hypocrisy and controlling nature of Hetfield. It's hypocritical because James was allowed to take a year off to work on himself, essentially putting the whole process on hold. But it's not okay for the band to stay behind and even listen to a track without James's presence. If we all know Hetfield begins, and we all do know that 4 o'clock is the stop time, then I won't feel like the heel, I have a feeling that you guys are going to go in there and listen to the stuff, and that's not right. It also showed how much weight Hetfield carried in the group, and not just creatively. When James tries to justify them all leaving at 4 o'clock, with platitudes about productivity and maximising studio time, both Kirk and Bob nod and agree with him, while Phil stays silent. In fact, when Bob actually has the gall to suggest that, quote, at some point we're going to have to work a little harder, James responds immediately with, quote, what does that mean? More hours? I got fearful there. Lars is the only one who has the balls to call him on it, saying that it all sounds good in theory, before advising his friend not to talk it, but to walk it. After some more debating, James walks out yet again, slamming the door behind him, while all 4 of them go in and listen to the music, 3 of whom do it willingly behind his back. As a fan and a person, I respected James's desire to seek treatment, and even his wish to reduce his working hours. In many ways, he had earned that privilege by this point. But I still cannot respect his attitude to hamstring his bandmates due to his own demons and personal problems. Again, to his credit, he and James had a final blowout where Lars confronts James about his need to control things, a character flaw Hetfield often attributed to Ulrich. It's one of the most tense scenes in the entire movie, ending with Lars screaming the F word right in his bandmate's face, to which James actually showed commendable restraint. This serves as the last real moment of strife between James and Lars, and aside from an almost unbearably cringy encounter with Towel over overstepping his boundaries with the band, this leads to the ultimate dissipation of interpersonal tensions, and the ushering in of an imperfect, somewhat sterile, but ultimately peaceful vibe that reverberates within the band, which is still intact to this present day. Most of you will know how the Metallica fairy tale ended after this, but for those who don't, I'll give you a very brief synopsis. Saint Anger, although wildly panned by critics and fans alike, became the group's 4th consecutive #1 studio album. They embarked upon a worldwide stadium tour with new and current bassist Rob Trujillo. When the dust settled on the Madly in Anger with You tour, the band would go on to release 3 more albums, including One Disaster with Lou Reed, sorry, couldn't help it, in a musical climate which saw the resurgence of heavy metal beginning in the mid to late noughties. Along with the albums, the band released a video game, a movie, a whiskey brand, and would, over the next decade and a half, embark on a slew of stadium tours, as well as finding themselves inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The net result of all of the above meant that the Metallica machine was more well-oiled than ever, more lucrative than ever, and although lacking the fire and creative genius of yesteryear, was also more peaceful and content from all within the machine than at any other point in its history. But this video isn't about Metallica. It's about the band's founder, songwriter, frontman and soul, James Hetfield. I went hard on my musical hero there for a while, but much as with the rest of the band, Some Kind of Monster is ultimately a story of redemption for James. Kirk has commented on the change he saw in James post-rehab, saying that he saw sensitivity and compassion in his eyes that had never been there before. And as trite as that sounds, you can actually see that change occur in him during the documentary. Not just in the way he looks, but in the way he talks and how he expresses himself. Within the album's opening track Frantic are the lyrics of Birth is pain, life is pain, death is pain, which are inspired by what Buddhists call the dukkha, or the first of 4 noble truths, which is that life itself is suffering. Wisdom is gained in life by going through struggle and coming out at the other side. Life's most valuable lessons are learned through hardship. When we contrast Hetfield's words and demeanour before rehab and after rehab, we see a wisdom, calm and ability to reflect that just did not exist prior. When asked about the departure of Jason Newsted during an interview filmed in the documentary, Hetfield said, quote, "He felt like he wasn't free enough to do what he needed to do since he wasn't getting his creativity out in Metallica, and I totally understand that now. I didn't want him to enjoy Echo Brain more than Metallica. I didn't want anyone to leave Metallica. I didn't want to feel like we weren't enough. The way I learned how to love things was to choke them to death. Don't leave, you have to stay." Compare this to his combative and dismissive response just 2 years prior in the Playboy interview, and we can see an understanding, compassion and accountability that just didn't exist prior. There are two monologues from James that I really feel best sum up the singer's issues with alcohol, anger, and abandonment. The three A's that were the cause of his strife and inner turmoil, which the two A's of AA and therapy helped with immensely. The first occurs at San Quentin Prison, where the band visited to shoot a video for the album's title track. Prior to the performance, James went out and shared a few words with the prisoners. Speaking in a shaky voice, James expressed the following: "Anger is an emotion I've struggled with for pretty much all my life. There's a lot of misspent anger that has come out sideways for a lot of people, including yourselves. And if I hadn't have had music in my life, it's quite possible that I could be in here, or not even be in here, be dead. And I'd much rather be alive. Everyone is born good. Everyone's got the same size soul, and we're here to connect with that." After saying these words, a visibly emotional James walked off stage to cheers and applause from the incarcerated. Anger is indeed an emotion. However, anger is a surface emotion that masks a deeper hurt. Anger often manifests itself before or as a surrogate for sadness, depression, or fear. James often spoke about his angry demeanour during his younger years, while Lars saw, even before James did, that it masked a depression within him that came out, unsurprisingly, when he drank. The second one is during an interview with James where he discusses how life, particularly his family life, has been impacted positively by his sobriety. "I'm working really hard on being the best dad and husband I can be, and the best me. I don't want to lose any of the stuff I have, and I know it can all go away at one time, and that's a tough part of life. It's a total rebirth for me, looking at life in a whole new way. All the other drinking and all the other junk that I was stuck in, it was so predictable. I wake up the next day somewhere in some bed. I don't know who the person is next to me. I'm completely hungover. The results were the same." The possibility of losing his family, while perhaps not the only motivating factor in James's abstinence from drinking and his decision to seek help, was undoubtedly the biggest and most important one. In a later interview, James expounded on this, describing how his wife kicked him out of the house when he hit rock bottom. Quote, "My wife said, 'You're not coming back until you sort this out and get some therapy. Not just the drinking, but all the other crap that goes with it. You know, the disrespect, doing whatever you want whenever you want. I had to grow up. I had a family. At one point within therapy, I realised how much my life was messed up, how many secrets I had, how incongruent my life was, and disclosing all this to my wife. Stuff that happened on the road. Fear is a pretty huge motivator, and it motivated me. Having all these issues with abandonment and losing a group, losing people in my life. Fear is a word that comes up many times during some kind of monster. And in many ways, fear is the key word in the James Hetfield story. Fear of abandonment, fear of losing his wife, his kids, his band, his identity, fear of sobriety. When he was approached about the idea of touring after the release of Saint Anger, James was again fearful, saying, quote, "I want to tour, but I don't want to fall off the wagon. Doing things for the first time again, it's a little scary." You know, fear has a lot of negative connotations attached to it. It's often associated with cowardice or guilt or inadequacy. However, when James says fear is a great motivator, he's just speaking a universal truth. Fear is a great motivator, and in many ways, it is the primary motivator in life. And why do we work? Why do we seek companionship? Why do we create? Why do we exercise? This is not a philosophy video, but if you took the time to really think about it, and took the time to think about what motivates you to do the things that you do, you'd probably find that fear has, or at least to some degree, has a part to play in many, if not all of these decisions. My favourite scene in the documentary, and one which often gets overlooked, actually occurs directly after Hetfield's quote about touring for the first time sober. It's a shot of James on stage during the Black Album tour, beer in hand, toasting the crowd who gleefully cheer and take a drink with their metal icon. For me, this is actually the most haunting scene in the documentary because it encapsulates one of the great truths about alcoholism. And that's the fact that as corrosive and detrimental as alcoholism is to the consumer and to those around them, it's also always intrinsically linked to some of the fondest moments of the drinker's life. The image that is often painted of the recovering alcoholic is that prior to the sobriety, alcohol was the cause of every negative moment in their life. Oftentimes, they purposely overlooked the moments of happiness which occurred either as a direct result of the influence of alcohol or just happened to take place while it was being consumed. One of the things I hate hearing people say who are sober is that they don't miss alcohol at all. Now, this may be true for a tiny minority, but in most all other cases, I simply don't believe it. You cannot partake in any activity that brought you relief and good times, no matter how fleeting, and not miss that feeling whatsoever. That's what I love about this scene. The last shot in the movie of a younger James Hetfield drinking alcohol isn't of him lying in the gutter with a black eye and a bottle in his hand. It's of a younger, fit man in the prime of his life, physically, professionally, and creatively, drinking a beer in front of a crowd of adoring fans. It's an iconic moment, an enduring image of a man at the height of his power. It's an honest assessment of the man's journey going forward. This was a chapter in your life, but this is the next chapter. There is no doubt that you are better off sober, older and wiser, but you will never again live in that state of wild hedonism associated with your youth, groupies and substances. You've chosen the right path, the path that will ultimately bring you more peace, happiness and prosperity. But it comes with sacrificing this other part of your life, another part that you enjoyed. No matter how corrosive it was, it still brought you some pleasure. These are the kind of choices we all must make in life, to some degree or another. For James Hetfield, this was the biggest and most important one he ever made, and there is no doubt that he was a better man for making that decision. For 15 years, this was the reality that all the fans of the man and the group took for granted. If ever a band had a fairy tale ending, it was Metallica. And there, in the middle of the stage, still stood James Hetfield, the patriarch of the Metallica family, tall, smiling, proud and sober, as it was and as it shall remain evermore. Then, in 2019, the unthinkable happened. Hetfield re-entered rehab. 15 years, millions of albums, and even more millions of dollars later, James fell off the wagon. Normally, I'm not a fan of celebrities airing out their personal lives on social media. I find it a little desperate and, quite frankly, totally uninteresting. But for some reason, this was different. Maybe it's because James isn't known as a prominent social media presence. Maybe it's because I have a bias towards the man and his music. But I found a certain amount of integrity in the band choosing to reveal that James had gone back to treatment. And yes, it's true that neither James nor the band specifically said it was alcohol related, but we can safely assume that that's exactly what the cause was. In fact, in hindsight, if you look at videos of live performances, sound checks, and interviews from 2019, you can clearly see that James was under the influence. Slurred speech, glassy eyes, trying to shield himself from the camera as he swigged from bottles between songs. It's troubling to watch, given how seemingly successful Hetfield's recovery had been over a decade before this. Since the news broke in 2019, and the coronavirus restrictions which put the entire world under lockdown have loosened, James has left rehab and the band are back on the road. And while I, like many others, were disappointed and perhaps even a little judgmental in our immediate reaction to James going back to rehab, in reality we are in no place to judge. Because, frankly, alcoholism is a lifetime battle. Now don't get me wrong, I don't consider alcoholism to be a disease like many others do. I don't take the accountability away from the drinker, regardless of any past traumas they may have endured or their predisposition to excessive drinking. But even still, it's something that they have to be conscious of, pretty much for the rest of their lives. To Hetfield's credit, I've never heard him refer to his addiction to alcohol as a disease. And while he may qualify his motivation to drink, I've never heard him assign the blame for his decision to drink to anybody else. He takes accountability for his actions, like a real man does. So with that being said, what can we take away from the news that, only 2 years ago, James Hetfield was forced back into rehab? Honestly, I think the answer is as simple as, he probably just messed up. I know that may not be the deep philosophical answer you were looking for, but it's most likely the truth. The man gave in to temptation because, well, the man is human. And that's the ultimate lesson here. The news stripped away the rose-tinted glasses many of us donned when analysing the topic of Hetfield's sobriety, but that's our problem. The man is as prone to pressure, stress, sadness and loneliness as you and I are, and in what I can only assume was a moment of weakness where he took a drink either to numb a pain or enhance a pleasure he was feeling, the man made a mistake. However, regardless of what led to his relapse or how severe it was, the fact is that the man took the measures he felt were necessary to rectify the issue and hop back on the wagon. Again, he took accountability. And again, this is what a man does. There is no way to know whether James Hetfield will ever fall off the wagon again or not. All that I know is that, as of the time of recording, the man is sober. He is still on tour with the band he started 40 years ago. And most importantly of all, he managed to keep his family together. The man who grew up in a broken home and sought companionship and security in every facet of his life, from his friends to his music to even alcohol, now was the one thing he never really had, but perhaps the one thing he wanted more than anything else: a family. And that should be commended, even if it is one day at a time.